The sound was almost unbearable, a high, persistent ringing that seemed to come from inside the boy's own head. Theo squeezed his eyes shut, his small hands covering his ears in a desperate attempt to silence the noise no one else could hear. And then, something changed. An aged hand, weathered by time and hard labor, gently held a small metallic object. The fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from deep concentration, as that calloused hand brought the object closer to the boy's ear. For a brief, fleeting instant, Theo's face relaxed. The tension that permanently lived in his shoulders seemed to melt away. His lips traced something that could be mistaken for a smile. But the peace lasted only seconds. The bedroom door exploded inward with a violence that made the very air vibrate. Heavy, furious footsteps charged across the room. A deep male voice, thick with rage, echoed off the walls. "What the hell are you doing to my son? Drop that right now!" There was no time for explanations. Strong hands grabbed the elderly woman and shoved her against the wall with disproportionate, brutal force. The metallic object slipped from her fingers, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp crack, shattering into pieces. And in that instant, everything changed. But to understand how we got here, we need to rewind the clock. We need to meet the characters of this story which, like so many others, began with a misunderstanding and spiraled into something far greater than anyone could have ever imagined. A week before that shattering moment, life was running its usual course in that sprawling estate. Richard was the kind of man people called highly successful. At 45, he had built a corporate empire that afforded him everything money could buy. Tailored Italian suits, imported sports cars, a residence that looked more like a luxury museum than a home. But there was one thing money couldn't fix: the suffocating emptiness that haunted that house ever since his wife had passed away 2 years prior. Richard didn't talk about it. In fact, Richard didn't talk about much that actually mattered. His life was an endless loop of board meetings, urgent phone calls, and multi-million-dollar contracts waiting for his signature. He treated the people around him like cogs in a machine that had to run flawlessly. No questions asked. The staff knew all too well that ice-cold glare, that tone of voice that left no room for argument. To Richard, kindness was synonymous with weakness, and vulnerability was simply a character flaw. On the other side of this story was Miss Martha. 62 years of a life that had been anything but easy. A widow for a decade, she had been working as a housekeeper at Richard's estate for almost 3 years. Her calloused hands told the story of decades of backbreaking labor, but her eyes still held a profound sweetness that time hadn't been able to erase. She was the kind of person who prayed before going to sleep, who genuinely believed in the fundamental goodness of people, even when life relentlessly tried to prove her wrong. Theo was the reason Miss Martha woke up every day with a purpose beyond merely surviving. The 8-year-old boy was a fragile creature, with huge, sorrowful eyes that seemed to carry a weight far too heavy for his age. Ever since he lost his mother, a spark inside him had died. He didn't play like other kids. He rarely smiled. He spent hours locked in his own bedroom, avoiding the world and most of all avoiding his father. The headaches started a few months after the funeral. First, they were occasional. Then they became a constant, agonizing presence, and with them came the ringing. That high-pitched, relentless screech that only Theo could hear, tracking him day and night, turning his life into a silent, waking torture. Richard naturally took his son to the best doctors money could buy: world-renowned neurologists, exorbitant tests, consultations at luxury private clinics. The answer was always the same. There was absolutely nothing physically wrong with the boy. It was psychosomatic, they claimed. Childhood trauma, unprocessed grief, fancy medical jargon that offered zero actual solutions. Richard listened to the diagnoses with poorly disguised impatience. In his eyes, his son was just being weak, overly dramatic. He needed to focus on his prep school studies, stop complaining so damn much, and toughen up the way a real man should. After all, the real world was brutal, and the sooner Theo learned that, the better. But Miss Martha saw what the expensive specialists couldn't. She saw a profoundly lonely, terrified little boy who missed his mom and had no idea how to deal with a father who treated him like just another liability to be managed. So, without anyone asking, she started caring for Theo in a way that went far beyond her duties as a housekeeper. She talked to him while dusting the rooms. She snuck homemade chocolate chip cookies in her apron pockets. She told him stories from her own childhood, simple tales that made Theo forget, even if just for a few precious minutes, the searing pain living inside his head. And Theo, slowly, began to open up. He helped Miss Martha fold the laundry, following her around the massive house like a lost puppy who had finally found someone who accepted him. For the first time since his mother passed, the boy smiled. They weren't huge, beaming grins, but tiny flashes of joy that briefly lit up his melancholic face. It was on one of those afternoons that Richard came home earlier than usual. He had canceled a board meeting and decided to check if his son was following the rigorous study schedule meticulously drafted by his expensive private tutors. What he found, however, was something entirely different. Theo was in the laundry room, helping Miss Martha fold towels. The two were chatting in low voices, and the boy was actually giggling at something the housekeeper had said. It was a simple domestic scene, overflowing with a tenderness that should have warmed any father's heart. But it didn't warm Richard's. Quite the opposite. He felt a dark surge of something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was deep discomfort. Maybe it was raw jealousy. How could this woman, a lowly maid, pull smiles out of his own flesh and blood when he couldn't? How dared she forge this intimacy, this closeness that completely defied the natural hierarchy of his household? "Theo!" Richard's voice sliced through the air like a razor blade. The boy whipped around, the smile instantly vanishing from his face. "What exactly are you doing in here? Shouldn't you be studying?" Theo ducked his head, already bracing for that tone. Miss Martha took a cautious step forward, her gentle voice trying to defuse the tension. "Mr. Richard, the boy was just helping me out a little bit. He wasn't in the way at all, I promise." But Richard had zero interest in her promises. He stepped closer, his imposing, tailored presence dominating the cramped laundry room. "Martha, I pay you to clean this estate, not to distract my son from his academics. Theo has responsibilities. He has a legacy to build. He doesn't need to learn how to fold damn towels." The words were harsh, cutting deep. They carried a thinly veiled disgust, a crystal-clear message. Everyone needed to stay in their lane. The boy with his textbooks and elite tutors, the maid with her rags and bleach. Those boundaries were never to be crossed. Miss Martha lowered her gaze, her worn hands still clutching a half-folded towel. "I'm sorry, sir. It won't happen again." Her voice was meek, submissive, but something in her eyes betrayed a profound sorrow. Not for herself, but for the little boy who was now trudging back upstairs to his room, his small shoulders slumped, his light completely extinguished. That night, Theo suffered another brutal attack. The ringing returned with double the intensity, accompanied by a splitting, agonizing headache that had him sobbing quietly into his pillow. Richard, buried in urgent emails in his home office, didn't hear a thing. But Miss Martha did. Even though she had already clocked out and was getting ready to catch her bus, she silently crept up the stairs and knocked softly on the boy's door. Theo opened it, his eyes bloodshot and swollen from crying. Without a single word, Miss Martha walked in and sat on the edge of the mattress. She took the boy's small hands in hers, hands that were rough but infinitely tender, and began to pray in a hushed whisper. It wasn't a formal, memorized Sunday school prayer. It was a desperate, whispered plea to God, begging for relief for this child who was suffering so much. And then, surprisingly, she told Theo about something her own grandmother used to do back in the country when she was a little girl. Her grandmother, a rustic woman from the deep south, had a special, old-fashioned way of curing earaches. She used a small cone made of cloth and dried herbs, placing it near the person's ear, creating a gentle suction that, according to her, drew out the impurities and eased the pain. It was an ancient technique, passed down through generations, the kind of thing modern medicine would quickly dismiss as folklore or pseudoscience. But Theo, desperate for literally anything that could stop his agony, begged Miss Martha to try it. "Please," he whimpered, tears still wet on his cheeks. "It hurts so bad. None of the pills work. Please try it." Miss Martha hesitated. She knew she shouldn't. She wasn't a doctor, she didn't have a medical degree. But looking at that broken little boy, remembering how that very trick had worked for her decades ago, she made a choice. Over the next few days, in absolute secrecy, she began crafting the small, handmade device. She used clean linen, specific dried herbs she knew from her youth, assembling the whole thing with the delicate care of a master sculptor. And it worked. Or at least Theo swore it worked. After the very first session, the boy reported that the shrieking in his ears had faded for the first time in months. The headache, while not totally gone, was finally bearable. He slept better that night than he had since the day his mother died. In the days that followed, whenever Richard left for the firm, Miss Martha repeated the procedure. Theo started improving visibly. He got his appetite back, started playing with his action figures again, and showed genuine interest in the world around him. But they kept it all completely under wraps, knowing instinctively that Richard would furiously disapprove. Their mistake was letting their guard down. It was believing they could keep that secret forever. It was failing to predict that Richard, driven by a gnawing, paranoid suspicion that his son was acting different, would decide to come home in the middle of the day unannounced. And that brings us right back to that terrifying moment, the door being violently kicked open, Miss Martha's hand holding the device close to Theo's ear, Richard's enraged screams echoing through the bedroom, the brutal shove, the shattered object on the floor. In the days following that first secret treatment, something extraordinary had started to happen. Theo got better. It wasn't an overnight movie magic miracle, but a slow, undeniable transformation. The screeching that tortured him day and night began to dial down. The migraines, which used to leave him paralyzed in bed for hours, became less frequent, more manageable. For the first time in months, the kid could sleep through the night without waking up screaming. But it wasn't just that. Theo became a kid again. He dug out his forgotten toys from the back of the closet. He started clearing his plate at dinner. His eyes, once perpetually dead and hollow, gained a spark that Richard hadn't seen since before his wife's passing. The boy actually started running down the mansion's massive hallways, something he hadn't done in so long that the other staff members whispered about it, genuinely shocked and thrilled by the change. And in every single one of those moments, Miss Martha was hovering nearby. Not in an obvious or smothering way, but always present. She had become Theo's guardian angel, the person he bolted to when he needed comfort, when the ringing threatened to creep back, when the world just felt too damn heavy for his small shoulders. The bond between them had deepened into something that completely transcended a maid and her boss's son. It felt more like the sacred tie between a grandmother and her grandson, built on absolute trust, affection, and shared secrets. But secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a nasty habit of clawing their way to the surface. And Richard was a highly observant man, especially when it came to variables that slipped out of his control. He noticed the shift in his son. How could he not? The kid who used to spend weeks locked in his dark room was now coming down to dinner with a smirk on his face. The constant whining about head pain had practically stopped. It should have been a reason to celebrate, but in Richard's mind, it only set off alarm bells. He started interrogating him, subtle at first, then increasingly blunt. "Theo, are you actually taking your medication?" The boy would nod yes, but his eyes would dart away. "Your tutor says you're focusing better. How?" Theo would mumble something vague about just feeling better. And always, whenever Richard walked through the front door, there was Miss Martha lingering near his son, chatting, smiling, sharing some inside joke that he, the father, couldn't comprehend. Richard's paranoia grew like a dark cancer. He started showing up at the house at random hours, unannounced, trying to catch whatever his gut told him was going on. The rest of the staff noticed his escalating hostility, the way he'd glare at Miss Martha with narrowed, predatory eyes, like he was trying to crack a sickening code. And then, on a random Thursday afternoon, the whole thing blew up. Richard had a massive merger meeting scheduled, but the client bailed at the last minute. Pissed off, he decided to just head home. He didn't text anyone. He just got in his Porsche and drove, grinding his teeth over busted deals and the creeping sensation that something was going on under his own roof without his explicit authorization. When he unlocked the massive front doors, the house was dead silent. Too silent. He marched up the grand staircase, his heavy footsteps muffled by the plush carpet, and that's when he heard it. A strange, low hum coming from Theo's room. It was a soft, rhythmic buzzing, accompanied by a woman's voice murmuring something he couldn't make out. His heart pounded against his ribs. What the hell was happening in there? Richard didn't knock. He didn't clear his throat. He just grabbed the brass knob and shoved the door so hard it slammed against the drywall with a crack that echoed through the entire estate. And right there was the scene that validated his absolute worst suspicions, his darkest, most twisted paranoias. Miss Martha was sitting on the edge of Theo's bed, holding that bizarre, homemade contraption, right up to the boy's ear. Theo was lying flat, eyes closed, his face totally relaxed. There was a sickening intimacy to the scene, a blatant invasion of territory that Richard considered exclusively his property. And right then, a wire snapped in his brain. "What the hell are you doing to my son?" The words ripped out of him like an animal's roar, loaded with the toxic fury he'd been stockpiling for days. "Drop that right now!" He crossed the expensive rug in 3 massive strides, his hands clamping down on Miss Martha's shoulders, slamming her violently against the wall. The device flew from her grasp, hitting the hardwood floor and splintering into pieces. Tiny shards of cloth, dried herbs, and a delicate handcrafted copper cone scattered everywhere. Theo screamed, scrambling off the mattress. "Dad, stop! She was helping me." But Richard didn't even glance at the boy. His murderous glare was locked on Miss Martha, who was now pinned against the wall, a trembling hand clutching her bruised shoulder, her face ghost-white with terror. "Helping!" Richard's voice dripped with pure venom. "Helping? You were sticking this garbage in my son's ear. What kind of voodoo is this? What the hell are you doing to his head?" Miss Martha tried to speak, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "Mr. Richard, please let me explain. It's an old country remedy. My grandmother used to do it. It draws out the pain. It's nothing evil, I swear to God." "Don't you dare bring God into this," Richard barked, his voice cracking with rage. "Do you think I'm a moron? Do you think I don't know the kind of backwoods quackery you people push? You've been brainwashing my boy, filling his head with garbage, pulling your uneducated white trash witch doctor crap on him." The words were like bullets, each one packed with deep-seated classism and disgust. Theo was bawling now, desperately trying to wedge himself between his towering father and Miss Martha. "Dad, leave her alone. She fixed me. The doctors couldn't do it, but she did, please." But Richard was completely blind with rage. He grabbed Miss Martha by the upper arm and practically dragged her out of the bedroom. "You are fired. Grab your trash and get out of my house right now. Now!" He hauled her down the hallway, dragging her down the grand staircase, his roaring voice bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. "And if I find out you did any permanent damage to my kid, anything at all, I will sue you until you lose the roof over your head. Do you understand me?" The rest of the staff had clustered in the foyer, lured out by the screaming. They watched, absolutely paralyzed with horror, as Richard shoved Miss Martha toward the heavy oak doors. The elderly woman stumbled, nearly eating the marble floor, but caught her balance at the last second. Her frail hands were shaking violently, hot tears streaming silently down her deeply lined face. "Mr. Richard, please," she tried one final time, her voice shattered. "I never meant the boy any harm. I only wanted to help. He was in so much agony." "Shut your mouth!" Richard yanked the front door open with brutal force. "You're nothing but an ignorant old fool who doesn't know her place. Grab your shit and get out of my sight." He spun around to face the terrified staff, who were watching the meltdown in stunned silence. "And listen to me. If any of you so much as text this woman, you're fired on the spot. Are we clear?" Miss Martha stumbled out the door, not even allowed to grab the cheap person coat she had left in the utility closet. The heavy door was slammed behind her so hard the expensive portraits on the walls rattled. She stood there on the sprawling driveway, baking under the harsh afternoon sun, trying to process what the hell had just happened. A lifetime of honest, backbreaking labor, of genuine love, reduced to absolutely nothing in less than 3 minutes. Inside, Theo was sobbing hysterically at the top of the stairs, his wails echoing through a house completely devoid of empathy. Richard stomped past him without a single word, locking himself in his office. The rest of the staff scattered like roaches, retreating to their duties, nobody daring to whisper a word about what they had just witnessed. The silence that fell over that mansion was thick, suffocating, dripping with an injustice so loud it seemed to poison the very air. It's hard to stomach that a human being could be so damn cruel, isn't it? An elderly woman, who gave years of her life to honest work, who reached into the dark to pull a suffering kid out when no one else could, was publicly humiliated and tossed in the gutter like garbage. If your blood is boiling at this massive injustice, hit that like button right now to prove you stand with Miss Martha. That night, Theo didn't eat. He locked the deadbolt on his bedroom door and refused to speak to anyone. And for the first time in weeks, the ringing returned. Louder, more vicious than ever, riding alongside a migraine so blinding it made him vomit over the side of his bed. He cried until he passed out from pure exhaustion, death gripping his pillow, whispering Miss Martha's name like a prayer out into the void. Theo's downward spiral was rapid and brutal. On the very first night after Miss Martha was thrown out, the high-pitched shriek returned like a vengeful ghost. But it didn't just come back. It was deafening now, violently aggressive, as if it had been lifting weights during its brief absence. The kid spent the entire night wide awake, pressing the heels of his hands against his ears so hard he left angry red bruises on his skin. The migraines crashed over him in sickening waves that folded him in half, whimpering softly just so he wouldn't attract his father's attention. Richard, barricaded inside his oak-paneled office, convinced himself this was just a temporary withdrawal. The kid was spoiled, too used to the suffocating coddling of that fired maid. Give it a few days, and everything would reset to normal. He was dead sure of it. But the days dragged on, and Theo only deteriorated. The following Monday, the prep school called. The administrator used that perfectly flat, carefully rehearsed tone people use when they have to deliver terrible news to rich parents. "Mr. Richard, you need to come collect your son. Theo had a severe episode during his AP math block." The word episode made Richard's chest tighten, but he kept his voice icy and professional. He told her he'd be there in 20 minutes. When he pulled up to the elite ivy-covered private academy, he found his son in the nurse's office. Theo was curled up on a sterile cot, his eyes swollen to slits from crying, his hands still clamped fiercely over his ears. The school nurse whispered that Theo had just started screaming out of nowhere in the middle of a lecture, clawing at his head and begging for the noise to stop. He threw up all over his desk, then passed out cold. The other rich kids were horrified, the faculty deeply alarmed. Richard stared down at his son and, for the first time in days, felt a cold spike of something resembling actual fear. Not strictly for Theo's well-being, but for what the optics meant. For what the other billionaire parents on the PTA would gossip about. For the terrifying possibility that something was fundamentally broken and completely out of his grip. He hauled Theo straight to another top-tier specialist, this time an even more expensive Ivy League neurologist, operating out of a clinic that looked like a 5-star wellness retreat. Imported marble floors, built-in saltwater aquariums, receptionists who spoke 3 languages. The doctor, a silver-haired guy sporting Tom Ford glasses, examined Theo with the polished patience that only a $1,000 an hour fee can buy. MRIs, CT scans, vials of blood drawn, audiology panels. The doctor scrutinized every square inch of Theo's brain, hunting for a tumor, a lesion, anything to explain the hell the kid was living in. And at the end of the day, after hours of poking and thousands of dollars wasted, the verdict was exactly the same. Perfectly healthy. The scans were immaculate, spotless. The issue, the doctor explained in that buttery tone reserved for billing the ultra-wealthy, was purely psychiatric. Post-traumatic stress disorder triggered by maternal loss. Somatic symptom disorder. The boy needed a top-shelf shrink, maybe some heavy-duty psychiatric meds. Not a brain surgeon. Richard absorbed all of this with white-knuckled fists. He had burned a small fortune just to be told, yet again, that the defect was in his kid's mind. That his son was mentally fragile. That the cure lay in crying on a couch and popping pills, not in a swift, clean surgical fix. He grabbed Theo by the shoulders and marched him back to the SUV in dead silence. The boy sobbed quietly in the leather back seat, endlessly repeating a name that made Richard's grip on the steering wheel turn lethal. "Miss Martha. I want Miss Martha." Meanwhile, on the grimier side of the city, in a neighborhood light years away from those marble-floored waiting rooms, Miss Martha was surviving her own freefall. The brutal firing was only the opening act. Richard, vindictive to the core, had made absolutely sure she'd never work in that zip code again. He personally called the elite staffing agencies that supplied maids to the gated communities. He blacklisted her, spun lies that she was dangerously incompetent, that she practiced freakish occult rituals, that she wasn't safe around children. A billionaire's words carry heavy ammunition. They have massive reach. Miss Martha found this out in the most soul-crushing way possible. Every single time she rode the bus for a housekeeper interview, the door slammed in her face the second her previous employer came up. "Sorry, the position's been filled." Always the same rehearsed line. Always the same nervous, avoidant eye contact. She knew exactly what was happening. Richard's venom had branded her a total outcast. Miss Martha's savings were pathetic. Decades of scrubbing toilets had yielded barely enough to cover the rent on her roach-infested studio apartment and some cheap groceries. But with zero income, that meager stash vanished like water on hot asphalt. By the end of the first month, her landlord banged on the door. He was a scrawny guy with a pencil mustache, speaking with that fake polite customer service voice used right before ruining someone's day. "Martha, you know I got a mortgage to pay too, right? If you don't have the cash by Friday, I'm putting an eviction notice on the door." She promised she'd get him the money. It was a lie. She was totally broke. She started skipping meals, eating only once a day. Canned soup, maybe a single slice of stale bread. Her thrift store clothes started hanging off her shrinking frame. Her eyes, once radiating maternal warmth, took on that hollow, glazed-over stare of someone who hasn't slept in weeks, someone carrying a cross way too heavy for their bones. But even in the pitch-black rock bottom of her life, Miss Martha thought about Theo. Every single night, kneeling beside her lumpy mattress, she prayed for the rich man's kid. She wept, begging the Lord to pull the agony out of that boy's head. And then she made a decision that felt borderline insane, but it was the only move she had left. She had to rebuild the device. The exact tool that had saved Theo. The one Richard had smashed to hell. The truth about that bizarre object was vastly deeper than Richard could have ever fathomed. It wasn't just some spooky voodoo passed down by Martha's hillbilly grandma. It was a masterpiece engineered by her late husband, Samuel. Samuel was a blue-collar tradesman, a humble guy with calloused hands but a brilliant, restless mind. He worked as a metal worker and carpenter, welding and carving custom pieces to sell at flea markets. But his crown jewel, the project he protected with his life, was a tiny gadget he built specifically for his wife. Back in her 20s, Miss Martha was plagued by a horrific case of severe tinnitus, a condition the doctors of that era just shrugged at. Samuel, fueled by pure love and stubborn grit, spent months in the public library. He fused ancient thermal pressure therapies with his elite metalworking skills. He forged a delicate, highly specific copper cone, engineered with a precise internal chamber, wrapped in heat-resistant fabric treated with a very specific blend of natural anti-inflammatories. It wasn't black magic. It wasn't witchcraft. It was master craftsmanship married to holistic science, tested and dialed in until it was perfect. And it worked flawlessly. Miss Martha used that copper cone for years, firing it up whenever the ringing threatened to return. When Samuel passed away, she kept the device as a holy relic, a physical piece of his love left behind. And when she saw little Theo rotting away in pain, she saw a terrifying mirror of her own past agony. And she chose to resurrect Samuel's invention. It took her weeks, scavenging cheap materials she could afford, but the replica saved Theo. It actually saved him. Now the original replica was garbage, shattered on the boy's bedroom floor, swept into the trash like it was nothing. And Miss Martha, even while staring down the barrel of homelessness, started pinching every single penny she could find. She sold her winter coat. She pawned a pair of silver earrings her mother had left her. She scraped together, quarter by quarter, just enough cash to buy a small sheet of pure copper and the right botanical extracts from an apothecary. Her arthritic hands, still possessing muscle memory, got to work. Every night, under the buzzing, jaundiced light of her cheap ceiling bulb, she bent the metal, stitched the dense fabric, raising Samuel's ghost from the ashes. It was agonizingly slow. It was emotionally brutal, because every strike of the hammer reminded her of the husband in the ground, the decent life she used to have, and the little boy currently suffering miles away. But she didn't quit, because it was the only damn thing she knew how to do. It was her only weapon against the cruelty of the world. Meanwhile, back in the sprawling mansion, Richard was running an investigation of his own. After the nuclear rage had finally burned out, after weeks dragged by with Theo's condition nosediving, a tiny toxic splinter of doubt lodged itself in his brain. He kept flashing back to the crushed object on the floor. In the heat of his meltdown, it looked like backwoods trash, the byproduct of ghetto superstition. But now, pacing his room at 3 a.m., the question kept gnawing at him. What the hell was that thing exactly? He slipped into Theo's room one night after the boy had finally passed out from sheer exhaustion. He checked the trash can, but it was empty. The maids had already cleared it. Pissed, he summoned the head housekeeper. What happened to the trash pulled from Theo's room last week? The woman, terrified, stammered that it was standard refuse, but the heavier debris might still be in the industrial dumpsters out back, waiting for the weekly sanitation pickup. Richard marched out to the freezing alley himself, something he hadn't done in the entire time he'd owned the estate. He ripped open heavy-duty black trash bags until he found it. Shredded fabric, dried botanical flakes, and right there, smeared in coffee grounds but totally intact, the crushed copper cone. He wiped the metal off, holding it up to the security lights. It was intricately fabricated. There were deliberate acoustic grooves cut into the metal, a level of surgical precision that screamed of hundreds of hours of trial and error. This wasn't the work of an ignorant witch doctor. It was highly advanced engineering. It was art. Richard's morbid curiosity rapidly mutated into a desperate obsession. He fired up his MacBook and dove down a rabbit hole. He typed in, "Ancient tinnitus thermal treatment. copper acoustic ear cone, holistic auditory pressure therapy. And to his absolute shock, the hits came rolling in. Yes, they were old. Yes, modern pharmacology had labeled them placebo or obsolete. But there were clinical case studies, peer-reviewed papers hypothesizing how conductive metal heat and highly specific mild vacuum pressure could, on a biomechanical level, drain deep inner ear inflammation that pills couldn't touch. Then he did something that made his own stomach turn. He started running a background check on Miss Martha, not to find ammo to ruin her this time, but driven by a terrifying, creeping sense of dread. He pulled strings with his private investigators. He found out she was a widow, that her late husband was a master fabricator, that she had a pristine, spotless 40-year work history without a single complaint, until he personally fired and blacklisted her. Nobody in her past had a single bad word to say about her. The only poison attached to her name was the venom he had spat himself, and slowly, agonizingly slowly, a massive crack formed in Richard's granite ego. A tiny, sickening realization burning his throat like battery acid. What if he was dead wrong? What if that poor woman was genuinely just trying to save his kid? What if he, blinded by his monstrous arrogance and billionaire elitism, had violently destroyed the one literal cure on Earth that was actually fixing his son? But pride is a brutal prison to break out of, and Richard was still miles away from looking in the mirror and admitting he might have committed an unforgivable, catastrophic sin. Richard's insomnia turned terminal. Night after night, he laid wide awake in his king-sized bed, staring at the vaulted ceiling, his brain short-circuiting. Theo was fading fast. The kid's muffled screams bled through the walls of the mansion, a relentless broadcast of Richard's total failure as a father. But it wasn't just the guilt now. That tiny splinter of curiosity had metastasized into a rabid obsession. He needed the absolute truth about that device, about Miss Martha, about the whole damn thing. Richard launched an offensive with the same cutthroat intensity he used in corporate takeovers. He exploited his high-level contacts, cashed in favors, paid thousands in off-the-books wire transfers for intel. And what he unearthed over the next few weeks hit him like a freight train. Miss Martha's husband wasn't just a guy who worked with his hands. Samuel Evans had been, in his own uneducated blue-collar way, a borderline savant. Richard dug up archived public records, scanned microfilms of 30-year-old local newspapers. Samuel had been bending metal since he was a teenager, but his true obsession lay in a highly niche field: the biomechanical relationship between acoustic frequencies and human anatomy. He had burned years in city libraries, hounding acoustic engineers and rogue audiologists who actually gave a damn to listen to a grease-stained mechanic with wild ideas. And eventually, he built something revolutionary. The device Samuel engineered wasn't faith healing or a scam. It operated on hard physics, even if it looked like a handmade trinket. The pure copper chamber, once activated by human body heat and anchored at a highly specific anatomical angle, generated a low-frequency harmonic resonance that intercepted and neutralized the phantom nerve signals causing chronic tinnitus. Paired with the vaporized anti-inflammatory botanicals, the rig delivered actual, localized relief for a neurological nightmare that multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies were still failing to cure. But the kill shot came when Richard opened a scanned PDF of an obscure local gazette. The headline read, "Local welder rejects six-figure buyout for medical gadget." The article detailed how a massive predatory biotech firm had offered Samuel a life-changing lump sum for the exclusive patent rights to his copper device. They wanted to mass-produce it in plastic and sell it at an insane markup to rich patients in private clinics. Samuel's direct quote, printed in black and white, made Richard's lungs stop working. "I built this to stop people from hurting, not to buy a Cadillac. Anybody who needs one can come knock on my door, and I'll build it for them for free, or whatever they got in their pocket." Richard read that quote 3 times. A guy who had the golden ticket out of poverty, a chance to change his bloodline forever, had spit in a corporation's face because of his morals, out of pure empathy. It was a concept so completely alien to Richard's predatory mindset that his brain rejected it. In Richard's universe, everything had a price tag. Every handshake was a transaction. The concept of bleeding profits for the sake of altruism was a sucker's game. But Samuel had done exactly that. And then, completely by accident, Richard stumbled onto the nuke that leveled his world. He was pacing through the cramped servants' quarters, standing in the tiny room where Miss Martha used to keep her locker. just cheap stuff left behind. A spare uniform, a stick of deodorant, a heavily worn Bible. But shoved in the back of the bottom drawer was a small cedar box. Richard cracked it open, feeling the slimy guilt of an intruder, but literally unable to stop himself. Inside were faded Polaroids, a smiling family, a broad-shouldered guy with rough hands and a warm grin. Samuel, obviously. Miss Martha, decades younger with dark hair, and a kid, a little boy, maybe 7 or 8, with massive eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach them. There was a haunting sickness in that kid's eyes, real agony. But what completely paralyzed Richard was a small journal, a beat-up leather-bound notebook filled with neat, cursive handwriting, a diary. Richard knew it was a violation. He knew he was crossing an unforgivable line of privacy. But his hands were already peeling back the brittle pages, his eyes tearing through the ink. The first entries were over 20 years old. Miss Martha wrote about her son, Michael. The kid suffered from agonizing cluster headaches from the time he was a toddler, screeching tinnitus that had him screaming into the mattress all night long. She documented the absolute hell of dragging him to expensive clinics that found nothing, arrogant doctors writing it off as stress, prescribing heavy narcotics that turned the kid into a zombie but didn't touch the pain. The exact parallel to Theo's nightmare was so violent, it made Richard literally gasp for air. And then the pages shifted to Samuel pulling all-nighters in his freezing garage, scrapping metal, drawing blueprints, failing, cursing, and trying again. Until finally, on a page heavily warped by dried teardrops, Miss Martha had written, "Samuel did it. The rig works. Michael slept through the night for the first time in 6 months. My baby is smiling again. Thank God for my husband's hands." Richard's hands were violently shaking as he turned the pages. The next entries were soaked in pure relief, Michael getting his life back, riding his bike. But then, without warning, the ink turned erratic. Michael got sick. Not from the headaches, but something else. Aggressive pneumonia, the journal said. Massive complications. The ER docs tried everything, but his lungs filled up too fast. The infection was too lethal. And in a final entry, written in a handwriting so shattered it was barely legible, Miss Martha documented the afternoon they buried their only child in the dirt. "I lost my boy. My Michael is gone. Samuel is a dead man walking. I am shattered. But at the very least, in his final months on this earth, we gave him peace. We killed that monster in his head. Samuel's machine gave him comfort. And for that, even while I'm drowning in this grief, I thank God." The pages covering the following years detailed how Miss Martha and Samuel forced themselves to keep breathing. Samuel kept welding the devices for random strangers, flat out refusing to take a dime of profit. "It's how he keeps Michael's ghost alive," Martha wrote. "Every kid he fixes is a way to cheat the grave." And then, a decade later, another brutal hit. Samuel dropped dead of a massive coronary. Miss Martha was left completely alone. The newer entries were sparse, the handwriting trembling with age and arthritis. But one page, dated just a few months ago, made Richard's heart completely stop beating in his chest. "I met a boy today. Theo, my boss's son. He has the exact same demon in his ears that my Michael had. That same screaming torture. I looked at him and saw my own dead son staring back at me. It broke me. The rich doctors can't fix him, just like they couldn't fix Michael. But I can. I have Samuel's master prototype. I've kept it hidden in velvet all these years. I'm going to try and save Theo, even if I have to do it in the shadows. I will not stand by and watch another boy rot in pain when I hold the cure in my hands. It's what Samuel would demand. It's what Michael would want." Richard dropped the leather journal on the floor. He sat there, collapsed on the cheap cot in the maid's quarters, and the sheer gravity of reality crushed him like a collapsing building. That woman wasn't doing witchcraft. She wasn't brainwashing his son for money. She was ripping her own healed wounds wide open, staring her dead child's ghost in the face just to save a rich kid she owed absolutely nothing to. And he, Richard, in his blind, toxic arrogance, his disgusting elitism, his absolute certainty that a platinum credit card bought the truth and poor people were just uneducated trash, had bulldozed everything. He had publicly humiliated her, tossed her on the street to starve, and he had physically shattered the last working prototype on Earth, the final piece of her husband's legacy, the only weapon that could stop his own son's screaming. He was the monster, not her. He was. The revelation didn't hit him like a dramatic movie climax. It drowned him like a slow, suffocating wave of pure self-hatred and horror. Richard saw his own reflection for the first time. A ruthless billionaire who used his leverage to crush people who couldn't fight back. A father so neurotically obsessed with maintaining a sterile, perfect image that he had violently smashed his own kid's life support. A man whose towering ego had inflicted ungodly trauma on an innocent, broken woman who only wanted to stop a child from bleeding. He thought about Miss Martha right then. Where the hell was she? Was she sleeping on the pavement? She who had buried her son, buried her husband, and now had her income, her reputation, and her basic human dignity stripped away because he threw a tantrum. And Theo, his own flesh and blood, was still upstairs, rotting, still shrieking into his pillow every night. Because his dad had broken the one thing that made the pain stop. For the first time in 30 years, Richard broke. Not polite, silent tears, but violent, ugly sobs that tore out of his chest and shook the floorboards. He wept for his boy. He wept for Miss Martha. He wept for a dead kid named Michael he never even met, whose tragedy would now haunt him until his dying day. And he wept for his own soul, for the absolute piece of garbage he had morphed into while he was busy counting his money. But crying on a mattress didn't fix shattered bones. Regret didn't pay the rent. And Richard, swiping the tears off his face, staring at the worn cover of the diary, realized he had to go to war. He had to rebuild the ruins he created, if God would even let him. The hunt started that exact minute. Richard couldn't stay in that sterile mansion for another second, suffocating under the weight of what he'd done. He grabbed the keys to his Mercedes and peeled out of the gated driveway without telling security a damn thing. He had exactly one lead, the gritty address typed on Miss Martha's original W-2 forms. A decaying neighborhood on the absolute wrong side of the tracks, the kind of grid where guys wearing Rolexes usually ended up in the trunk. He pushed the car way past the speed limit for an hour, leaving the manicured, tree-lined suburbs behind, diving deep into narrow, cratered streets lit by flickering street lamps. The six-figure luxury sedan stuck out like a sore thumb against the backdrop of boarded-up duplexes, sagging power lines, and kids playing on concrete porches at midnight. People on the corners locked onto the Mercedes with hard, predatory stares. Richard felt stripped bare, exposed in a way his money couldn't shield him from. The GPS pinned him at a rotting two-story brick tenement, with peeling paint and a rusted-out iron fire escape clinging to the side. Unit 2B. Richard hauled himself up the metal steps that groaned under his weight, his pulse hammering a hole in his chest. As he hit the landing, he heard voices bleeding through the thin plywood door. One was a guy, nasal, aggressive, bullying. The other was a woman, exhausted, broken, pleading. He slammed his fist against the door. The voices instantly died. Heavy boots approached, locks clicked, and the door jerked open to reveal a scrawny guy rocking a pencil mustache, the landlord. He sized Richard up, taking in the bespoke suit and the tailored wool coat, clearly thrown off by the presence of serious money in his slum. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Martha," Richard growled, his voice a lethal, low rumble. The guy scoffed, rolling his eyes. "The old lady's busy. We're having a very serious chat about 60 days of back rent." He tried to slam the door, but Richard shot his leather shoe into the jamb, stopping it dead. "Move. Now." That's when he heard her voice drifting from the back of the shoebox apartment. "Who is it, Mr. Henderson?" And then, as Richard pushed the door open and stepped into the dim light, his eyes locked onto hers. Miss Martha was sitting on a plastic folding chair, her frail hands clasped in her lap, her face gaunt and terrifyingly pale. When she processed who was standing in her kitchen, all the blood drained from her face. "Mr. Richard?" Her voice cracked with absolute terror. She was genuinely terrified he had tracked her down to throw her in a jail cell. Richard shoved the landlord aside like he was moving a curtain and stepped into the room. It was a miserable, suffocating box, a lumpy twin mattress shoved against peeling wallpaper, a two-burner hot plate caked in grease, a plastic card table. A stack of cardboard boxes in the corner made it obvious she was already packing her pathetic belongings for the streets. The stench of black mold and cheap cigarettes hung heavy in the air. This was her reality. This was the hellhole he had condemned her to. "What do you want from me?" She pushed herself up against the back wall, instinctively raising her hands. "You took my job, you ruined my name, and I'm getting thrown on the street tomorrow. What else is there left for you to take?" The words hit him like a shotgun blast to the chest. Richard opened his mouth, but his throat was sealed shut. "How do you even bridge a gap this monstrous?" The landlord stood there, completely lost. "You guys know each other?" "She worked for me," Richard said, never breaking eye contact with the elderly woman. "And I committed a catastrophic sin." He sucked in a jagged breath, and then did something he hadn't done since he was a child. Something that violated every single ruthless, alpha male code that had built his empire. Richard dropped to his knees right there on the sticky, rotting linoleum floor. Miss Martha gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. The landlord physically recoiled, eyes wide. Richard, a billionaire, kneeling in the dirt before the maid he had destroyed, let the dam break. "I read your journal. I know about Samuel. I know about your baby boy, Michael. I know exactly what you were trying to do for Theo." His voice fractured into rough, jagged pieces. "And I know that I am the one who destroyed it. You weren't a witch. You weren't manipulating my kid. You were reaching into hell to pull him out, exactly like Samuel did for Michael, exactly like you did for all those other kids. And I, with my sickening pride and my disgusting arrogance, smashed the only lifeline my son had. I shattered your husband's legacy. I ripped away your dignity. And then I made damn sure you'd starve trying to find work." Hot tears were streaming down his face now, blurring his vision, and he didn't give a damn who saw them. "I am the villain of this story, Martha. Not you. It was never you. And I didn't drive down here to ask for your forgiveness, because I belong in hell for what I did. I came here to beg you to save my boy. He is dying in front of my eyes. His screams shake the walls every single night. The billion-dollar doctors can't do a damn thing. And I know, as sure as I'm breathing, that you are the only human being on this earth who can stop his pain." The silence in that tiny room was deafening. Miss Martha stared down at the titan of industry sobbing on her floor, a hurricane of emotions flashing across her exhausted face. Agony, blinding anger, absolute shock, and finally, that unbreakable divine grace that Richard had tried so hard to crush. "My boy is burning in the exact same fire Michael burned in," she whispered, her voice fragile as glass. "Every night I get on my knees for him. Every night I beg the Lord to pull the fire out of his head, even after the hell you put me through." Richard choked on a sob. "I don't deserve you. I don't deserve an ounce of your mercy. But Theo does. Please. I will empty my bank accounts. I'll sign over everything. Just please, God, fix my son." Miss Martha looked at him for a long, agonizing minute. Then, very slowly, she reached out her calloused, arthritic hand. Richard grabbed it like a drowning man grabbing a rope, pulling himself to his feet while clutching her fingers like a lifeline. "I'll fix your boy," she said, her voice turning to steel. "Not for you, but because no child deserves to suffer in the dark when I hold the match to light the room. It's what Samuel built it for. It's what Michael would demand of me." Richard wanted to pull her into a desperate hug, but he stopped himself. He hadn't earned that right. Instead, he snapped his head toward the landlord, who was glued to the wall, mouth hanging open. "What is the balance?" "2 grand, plus late fees, 2,400, the guy stammered. Richard ripped his platinum money clip out of his coat, pulling out a thick stack of $100 bills. He slapped 30 bills into the man's shaking hands. "That clears it, and that covers the next year in advance." He pulled out another stack. "Nobody breathes heavily in her direction ever again. Do we have a crystal clear understanding?" The landlord practically choked on the cash, nodding violently before sprinting out the door like the building was on fire. When they were alone, Richard turned back to the woman who held his kid's life in her hands. "I need you in the car. Right now. I need you to build it again. I will buy you a factory if you need it. Any material, any tool, top-tier engineers. Just save my son." Miss Martha looked at the pathetic cardboard boxes, at the moldy walls of the prison she called home, and gave a single nod. "I need high-grade, pure thermal copper, seasoned oak, and very specific medicinal herbs, and time. If I rush the forge, the acoustics fail. You have a blank check," Richard swore. "Whatever it takes." They drove back to the massive estate in total silence. When the Mercedes rolled past the wrought iron gates, the night staff froze in shock. The maid was back, and the ruthless boss was treating her like absolute royalty. Richard personally escorted her to the VIP guest suite, a massive room with vaulted ceilings and a king bed. "This is yours for as long as it takes. Actually," he corrected himself, swallowing hard, "it's yours permanently if you want it." But Miss Martha didn't even look at the silk sheets. She demanded to see the boy. Richard led her down the hall to Theo's room. The kid was awake as always, locked in the fetal position, his hands crushing his ears, his face a wet mask of pure agony. When Theo cracked his eyes open and saw Miss Martha standing in the doorway, his lungs hitched. Nana Martha. The nickname slipped out of him naturally, like it had always belonged there, waiting in the dark. You came back? She rushed to the bed, hot tears pouring down her cheeks, and threw her arms around the trembling boy. I'm back, my sweet boy. I'm right here, and I'm going to turn the noise off, I promise. That very night, Richard unleashed his wealth like a weapon. He woke up suppliers at 2 a.m., called in favors to get the CEO of an acoustic engineering firm out of bed, and gutted a spare bedroom to build a hyper-sterile workshop. He paid black market prices to overnight the purest medical-grade copper available. He flew in exotic, hyper-potent botanicals. Miss Martha didn't sleep a wink. Her hands, fueled by adrenaline and muscle memory, commanded the room. The Ivy League acoustic engineer stood in the corner, totally mesmerized as she charted out the exact harmonic resonance frequencies on a whiteboard. My Samuel was a genius, she told the man, her chest swelling with fierce pride. He saw the math in the metal that guys with PhDs were totally blind to. By sunrise, the weapon was forged. It was a masterpiece, vastly superior to the original thanks to the pure materials and laser precision tools. But the soul was identical. The exact same genius. The same desperate love welded into copper and oak. Miss Martha walked into Theo's room, sunlight bleeding through the blinds. The kid hadn't slept a single second. Richard trailed behind her, anchoring himself to the doorframe, terrified to breathe. She sat on the edge of the mattress exactly as she had months ago, and held the gleaming copper device with absolute reverence. Is it gonna burn? Theo whispered, his voice completely raw. No, baby. It never hurts. It's just going to suck the bad out. She positioned the cone near his ear, locking in the precise angle Samuel had perfected. The boy squeezed his eyes shut. For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then, millimeter by millimeter, the brutal tension started draining from Theo's jaw. His spine uncoiled. His white-knuckled fists slowly relaxed against the sheets. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the boy took a massive, shuddering breath, filling his lungs all the way to the bottom. The screaming, he breathed, his eyes still closed. It's fading. It's actually fading. When he finally opened his eyes, they were flooded with tears, but the terror was gone, replaced by blinding relief. It doesn't hurt, Nana. The monster is gone. Theo lunged into her chest, burying his face in her shoulder, hugging her with every ounce of strength in his frail body. And Miss Martha held him tight, sobbing violently into his hair, whispering thank yous to God and to Samuel. Richard stood in the doorway, watching the scene through a wall of tears, his frozen heart completely shattering and forging itself into something human again. Now I have to ask you, what do you think about Richard's massive turnaround at the end? Did he do enough to earn her forgiveness? Or is he still a monster? Drop your verdict down in the comments. But Richard's atonement didn't just stop at a dramatic apology. In the weeks that followed, he put his money where his mouth was. He didn't just back pay Miss Martha's wages. He wired a massive, life-changing settlement into a trust in her name. He personally drove to the offices of every single staffing agency he had poisoned, demanding meetings with the CEOs, publicly eating his own words, and formally clearing her name on company letterheads. But Miss Martha had zero interest in scrubbing toilets ever again. She had a holy war to fight now, and Richard funded the entire army. He bought her a gorgeous, sunlit house in a quiet, heavily secured suburb. Not a grotesque mansion, she stubbornly refused anything flashy, but a beautiful, sprawling home with a massive greenhouse in the back. And then came the killing blow. Richard liquidated a massive chunk of his stock portfolio to legally incorporate the Samuel and Michael Foundation, a fully funded, non-profit biomedical lab dedicated exclusively to fabricating Samuel's acoustic device and shipping it entirely free of charge to desperate parents whose kids were drowning in chronic tinnitus. He stacked the board with ruthless patent lawyers to protect the design from greedy pharma companies, and hired top-tier audiologists to refine the tech. And they quickly realized Samuel was dead on the money. The device triggered an incredible success rate in severe pediatric cases, where heavy narcotics had completely failed. The foundation officially launched 6 months later. The ribbon cutting wasn't some flashy gala for billionaires. It was quiet and intimate. Miss Martha cut the red ribbon herself, with Theo holding her hand, both of them beaming. Richard stood in the back of the room, leaning against the wall. He refused to give a speech. He refused to put his name on the building. This wasn't a PR stunt to scrub his soul clean. It was a lifelong debt he intended to pay in the shadows. In the following months, the lab shipped out dozens of units. Every single package that landed on a desperate mother's porch, every kid who stopped screaming and started smiling again, was a middle finger to the disease that killed Michael. It was a victory lap for a kid whose legacy was now actively saving the world. Theo completely came back to life. With the torture finally exorcised from his skull, he got to be a kid again. But not an arrogant, spoiled brat. He was a kid who had looked the devil in the eye and survived. And because of that, he fiercely guarded his joy. And he had something better than a trust fund. He had Nana Martha. She practically lived at the estate, showing up 3 days a week to spoil him rotten, always greeted by the boy sprinting across the yard to tackle her in a hug. And Richard fundamentally changed. It wasn't a magic trick. Toxic traits don't vanish overnight. But the armor cracked. He started actually listening to his board members instead of barking orders. He stopped viewing his employees as disposable assets and started seeing them as human beings with mortgages, sick kids, and actual lives. He finally understood that an Ivy League diploma didn't mean a damn thing if you didn't have a soul. That an old woman with calluses on her hands possessed a cosmic brilliance that billions of dollars could never buy. That true power wasn't crushing your enemies. It was having the terrifying courage to admit you were the bad guy. On a warm Saturday afternoon, almost a year after the explosion, Richard was sitting on the back patio of the estate. He had a coffee in his hand, just watching the lawn. Out there, bathing in the golden hour sun, Theo and Miss Martha were playing. The kid was sprinting through the grass, laughing so hard he could barely breathe. Miss Martha was chasing him in slow motion, pretending to be a swamp monster, her deep bell-like laughter mixing perfectly with his. It was such a basic, ordinary scene. Boring even. But to Richard, it was the single greatest masterpiece he had ever laid eyes on. That lawn held everything that actually mattered on this earth. It was living proof that redemption wasn't found in a checkbook, but in bleeding for the people you hurt. It was the ultimate proof that even a monster could, if he fought hard enough, step out of the dark and into the light. Miss Martha caught Richard staring and waved him over. A silent demand to get his suit wrinkled and join the game. Richard set his mug down and walked out into the grass, walking toward the sunlight, toward the laughter, stepping into a second chance he definitely hadn't earned but was given anyway. And for the very first time in his 45 years on Earth, the billionaire felt truly, undeniably rich. Not because of the zeros in his offshore accounts, but because of the brutal, beautiful lesson an old maid had violently carved into his soul. That empathy, humility, and the raw courage to fix what you broke are the only currencies that matter when you die. This brutal journey proves that our toxic pride and lethal arrogance can totally blind us to the angels standing right in front of us. But it is never too late to step up, own your sins, and rebuild the ruins. If you crave dark, emotional stories that rip your heart out and make you question what kind of human you are, hit that subscribe button and smash the bell to join our family. Every single week we drop intense, unforgiving tales of justice, revenge, and redemption that will force you to believe in the ultimate power of the human spirit.